round and round. Each time 'twould miss, we'd steal a kiss, and the merry-go-round went. The merry-go-round broke down and made the darndest sound. The lights went low, we both said oh, and the merry-go-round went. Oh, what fun, a wonderful time, finding love for only a dime. The merry-go-round broke down, but you don't see me frown. Things turned out fine, and now she's mine, 'cause the merry-go-round went. The merry-go-round broke down.
Coming from the studios of KPFK in Los Angeles, this is Jerry Beck, and you're listening to Cartoons in Stereo. I am the proprietor of two blogs, which I urge you to check out. One of them is cartoonresearch.com, where we talk about the history of animation every day with some new article or two. You'll love it if you're listening to this show. I also do one called Animation Scoop, which is all about the news of the industry and what's going on today, news, reviews, and commentary. Please check that out as well. I've written 15 books on the history of animation, and I love the music that comes out of cartoons, whether it's a cartoon from the 1930s or television animation in the 1960s, or feature films from Disney. The music is just wonderful, and that's what we celebrate here on this program. The first track we just listened to is The Merry-Go-Round Broke Down. What a perfect intro, the perfect way to start this program. Of course, that's the theme from the Looney Tunes cartoons from Warner Brothers, and it made its debut in 1937, and it made its debut that same year on the Looney Tunes cartoons. Carl Stalling picked that song up and thought it was a perfect way to begin those cartoons, and he was right. This was a version done by Russ Morgan and his orchestra on his program, his radio show, Music in the Russ Morgan Manner, which was broadcast April 29th, 1937. Jimmy Lewis did the vocal, and the vocal is very rare because we're so familiar with the tune, but we rarely get to hear the actual words. We're going to start our show today with a tribute to Max Fleischer. And what, you don't know who Max Fleischer is? Is that what you're telling me? Wait, my producer doesn't know who Max Fleischer is. I cannot believe this. Really. Marlene, really, I don't believe it. Max Fleischer was the man who produced the original Betty Boop cartoons, the classic Popeye the Sailor cartoons. He made sound cartoons and multiplane dimensional animation cartoons before Walt Disney did. He made feature films like Gulliver's Travels and Mr. Bug Goes to Town, and those classic 1940s Superman cartoons that have been so influential to anime and the Batman series later and this and that. Those are just classics. Max Fleischer. I'm going to do a few tunes from Max Fleischer films, although not necessarily from the films, as you'll hear. We're going to start off right now with Jack Mercer. Jack Mercer was one of the artists at the Fleischer Studio. He was a storyboard man. He came up with a lot of the stories. And when the original voice of Popeye, Red Pepper Sam, was feeling his oats, was his success as being the voice of Popeye went to his head. He started doing those cartoons in 1933, but by 1935, Billy Costello, a.k.a. Red Pepper Sam, wanted to be treated like a star, would come in late, maybe drunk, to some of the recording sessions, and they could have none of that. Luckily, one of the storymen, Jack Mercer, was imitating Popeye, Red Pepper Sam, as he was pitching his storyboards to the producers, and they said, you do it pretty well. In fact, I think you do it even better than the original guy, and they made Jack Mercer the voice of Popeye from 1935 till he passed away in the 1980s. He did them for Hanna-Barbera cartoons and for King Feature cartoons. He did them for any records, any use of Popeye. Jack Mercer was the voice of Popeye. He, by the way, did not give up his day job. He continued to write cartoons for Fleischer and Famous Studios as well. But he recorded this children's record. This is one of those, golden records. They were wax plastic, yellow-colored records that were sold for 29 cents in 5 and 10 cent stores back in the 60s. And he's backed up on this recording by the Sandpipers and Mitch Miller. Mitch Miller's orchestra was the house band for the Golden Records. So here's a rare recording of Jack Mercer singing the Popeye theme.
Oh, I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man. I'm strong to the finish, 'cause I eats me spinach. I'm Popeye the Sailor Man.
He's Popeye the Sailor Man.
Yes, I am.
He's Popeye the Sailor Man.
You eat your spinach?
He's strong to the finish, 'cause he eats his spinach. He's Popeye the Sailor Man.
Now I'm one tough gazookas, which hates all palookas. What ain't on the up and square? I biffs 'em and buffs 'em and always outroughs 'em, and none of 'em gets nowhere.
If anyone dashes to risk his fist, it's buff and it's wham, understand.
So keep good behavior, that's your one lifesaver with Popeye the Sailor Man.
He's Popeye the Sailor Man. He's Popeye the Sailor Man.
Skidabidee-dee-dee-do.
He's strong to the finish, 'cause he eats his spinach. He's Popeye the Sailor Man. He's Popeye, 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 Popeye.
Skidabidee-dee-dee-dee-do.
Popeye the Sailor Man.
Well, what do you know?
What we all need is brotherly love. You can't go wrong with brotherly love. Let everybody be one great big family. No snapping, no yapping, how happy we will be. Now I don't care whose brother you love, as long as there is brotherly love. Make every Tom and Dick and Otto obey your golden motto, 'cause what we need is brotherly love. No snapping, no yapping, how happy we will be. Now I don't care whose brother you love, as long as there is brotherly love. Make every Tom and Dick and Otto obey our golden motto, 'cause what we need is brotherly love. Are you listening, Popeye? Make every Tom and Dick and Otto obey our golden motto, 'cause what we need is brotherly love.
You're a nobody without a name. You're a nobody without a name. To be an individual, your name must mean considerable. You're a nobody without a name. You're a nobody without a name. So quote with mere formality, you've gotta have personality. In history, men were great because their names illuminate. You cannot stop or hesitate. You're a nobody without a name. You're a nobody without a name. To be a great John Monica, you've got to have a Monica. To get into the Hall of Fame, you gotta get a name. You must go to the castle at the end of the lane. There you will be greeted and given the name. Hurry before the sunset hour arrives, or you will be nothing but rags the rest of your lives.
Off we go, feeling so hippity-happy, merry-o. Off we go, 'cause we know we gotta get a name.
Don't worry. I'm only the camel with the wrinkled knees. And I'll take you to the castle with the greatest of ease.
You're a Nobody Without a Name. And that's from the soundtrack of Max Fleischer's Raggedy Ann and Raggedy Andy, a pretty obscure 1940 two-reel color cartoon that the Fleischers did, which I'm working on a restoration of that with SIFA Hollywood and the UCLA Film Archive right now. Hopefully we'll get that projected and shown, hopefully in theaters and on television in the next year or so. But we are working on restoring that rare lost Max Fleischer film. We started our set with Jack Mercer performing Popeye the Sailor Man, which of course is a classic film, and Jack Mercer, the original voice of Popeye. That was the Golden Records version of it. We followed that with a song from a Popeye cartoon, Brotherly Love, a great cartoon sung in the cartoon by Olive Oyl. Here, this track was performed by Gary Lucas, sung by Sarah Stiles. This is from a new album called Gary Lucas Fleischery, which I highly recommend you looking up on the internet and trying to find. It's a whole album full of Sammy Timberg, Winston Sharples, Max Fleischer music, and done with a lot of love, and I highly recommend it. We followed that with a recreation of the soundtrack to a Max Fleischer color classic called Little Lambkin. This was performed by Dean Mora and his Modern Rhythmists. This is a new album that's out called Boop Boop A Doing. That's the name of the album. And Dean Mora is a great musician who's been playing around Southern California, performing classic music from the 1920s and 30s. And he did this album a few years ago that was a tribute to the Fleischer Studio. We ended the set, of course, with You're Nobody Without a Name. And now we're going to go into a Disney tribute, and we're going to start it with kind of a companion song to that last track. This one's called You're Nothing But a Nothin', and it's from the 1934 Silly Symphony, The Flying Mouse. And this is I believe this is a record version, meaning a recording especially done for records, but it uses the original musicians and the original voices. Billy Sheets is the baritone bat, and you'll hear the three Rhythm Kings and Marceline Gardner. These are some of the voices from the original Silly Symphony short cartoon. You're nothing but a nothin'.
You're nothing but a nothing.
There was a mouse who longed to be a bird and fly about. He asked a fairy queen he knew to kindly help him out. This fairy queen gave him some wings and told him he could fly. And right away this little mouse went sailing through the sky. He flew into a big black cave, and hanging overhead there was a great big ugly bat who spoke right up and said,
Hello there, kid. You sure look like a brother bat to me.
Oh, no, I'm not. I'm a mouse. That's all I crave to be.
Now look-a here, no mouse can fly, so if you ain't a bat, There's only one thing you can be, you're nothing, think of that. You're nothing but a nothing, a nothing, a nothing. You're nothing but a nothing, you're not a thing at all. To be a bat's a bum thing, a silly and a dumb thing. At least a bat is something, you're not a thing at all.
He looked up suddenly and saw the fairy queen he knew.
I'll take away your wings if you would like me to. Just be yourself and then no one can ever say to you.
You're nothing but a nothing, a nothing, a nothing. You're nothing but a nothing, you're not a thing at all. To be a bat's a bum thing, a silly and a dumb thing. At least a bat is something, you're not a thing at all. You're nothing but a nothing.
If you want to join the Gates when they're at their best and meet a couple of future dates, well, Roger, I suggest hop in the old jalop and head for the molded shop.
And all the cats join in.
Down goes my last 2 bits, comes up 1 banana split.
And all the cats join in.
Now drop your jack in the old jukebox, play your favorite disc. When you dance with the Bobby Sox, you dance at your own risk.
Rip, everybody swing, yes, swing till the rafters ring.
And all the cats join in.
When you get in trouble and you don't know right from wrong, give a little whistle, give a little whistle. When you meet temptation and the urge is very strong, give a little whistle, give a little whistle. Not just a little squeak. Come on, pucker up and blow. Now, if your whistle's weak, then yell.
Jiminy Cricket!
Sure, take the straight and narrow path, and if you start to slide, give a little whistle, give a little whistle, and always let your conscience be your guide. When you get in trouble and you don't know right from wrong, give a little whistle, give a little whistle. When you meet temptation and the urge is very strong, give a little whistle, give a little whistle. Not just a little squeak. Come on, pucker up and blow. Now, if your whistle's weak, then yell.
Jiminy Cricket!
Sure, take the straight and narrow path, and if you start to slide, give a little whistle, give a little whistle, and always let your conscience be your guide.
Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me? M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. Hey there, hi there, ho there, you're as welcome as can be. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E.
Mickey Mouse! Mickey Mouse!
Forever let us hold our banner high, 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 high. Come along and sing the song and join the jamboree. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E. Mickey Mouse Club, Mickey Mouse Club. We'll have fun, we'll meet new faces. We'll do things and we'll go places. All around the world we're marching. Who's the leader of the club that's made for you and me?
M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E.
Hey there, hi there, ho there, you're as welcome as can be.
M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E.
Mickey Mouse,
Mickey Mouse.
forever let us hold our banner high, 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 high. Come along and sing a song and join the jamboree. M-I-C-K-E-Y-M-O-U-S-E.
The Mickey Mouse Club. I marched to that every day. I loved that show. Of course, that famous theme from the Mickey Mouse Club was written by Jimmy Dodd, who was the lead Mouseketeer on the show. And we'll never forget that. We just heard a tribute to the Disney studio with several cuts. Prior to the Mickey Mouse Club march, we had Cliff Edwards, Jiminy Cricket, of course, singing Give a Little Whistle. And like the previous recording from Jack Mercer earlier, this is the Golden Records version of Give a Little Whistle. It wasn't from the original Pinocchio soundtrack from 1940. No, this is from the 1960s with Mitch Miller and his orchestra. It was only sold on these little 29-cent records. Give a Little Whistle. That was preceded by Benny Goodman and his orchestra with a recording of All the Cats Join In, which was a great track. Vocals by Liza Morrow and Benny Goodman. And of course, not this track, but another track by Benny Goodman of this tune was used in the movie Make Mine Music, one of those great compilation films that Disney did during the 1940s, where they're almost like a set of music videos. Beautiful film, beautifully done. Thank you, Benny Goodman. We started the set with You're Nothing But a Nothin', which was from the track of the 1934 Silly Symphony, The Flying Mouse. Our next set is a tribute to television animation. I always like to do these. And this first part of that tribute is to the humorous cartoons, the funny cartoons, the cartoons we loved that made us laugh. We're going to start this set with the Flintstones. What better than them? And this is a special track. This is the Meet the Flintstones theme, but it's sung by the actual cast. Alan Reed, Gene Vanderpyle, Bea Benaderet, and Mel Blanc doing their voices. You'll hear the Rubbles and the Flintstones. Here they are.
Flintstones, meet the Flintstones. They're the modern Stone Age family. Hello, Fred and Wilma. They're a couple just like you and me.
Dino is our little dinosaur. He's good, but nobody knows what for.
When you meet the Flintstones, have a
yabba dabba do time. A dabba do time.
You'll have a gay old time.
I'm Fred's bosom buddy friend.
As long as he has a buck to lend.
When you're with the Rubbles,
have a scuba-dooba-doo time, a dooba-doo time.
You'll have a gay old time.
I told the witch doctor I was in love with you. I told the witch doctor I was in love with you. And then the witch doctor, he told me what to do. He said that... I told the witch doctor you didn't love me true. I told the witch doctor you didn't love me nice. And then the witch doctor he gave me this advice. He said that ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla bing-bang. 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 You've been keeping love from me just like you were a miser. And I'll admit I wasn't very smart. So I went out and found myself a guy that's so much wiser, and he taught me the way to win your heart. My friend, the witch doctor, he taught me what to say. My friend, the witch doctor, he taught me what to do. I know that you'll be mine when I say this to you. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang. You've been keeping love from me just like you were a miser, and I'll admit I wasn't very smart. So I went out and found myself a guy that's so much wiser, and he taught me the way to win your heart. My friend, the witch doctor, he taught me what to say. My friend, the witch doctor, he taught me what to do. I know that you'll be mine when I say this to you, oh baby. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang. Come on in. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bing-bang. Ooh-ee, ooh-ah-ah, ting-tang, walla-walla, bang-bang.
It's the Beanie and Cecil Show. Come go sailing, we've waited long enough for Beanie and Cecil, Dishonest John, and Captain Huff and Puff. It's time for adventure.
Oh, some fun.
Oh, joy.
With Cecil the Sea-Sick Sea Serpent and good old Beanie. Boy, 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 boy. But you.
Join us for fun with Beanie and...
Lovable, gullible, harmless, 10 foot tall and wet. Cecil the Sea-Sick Sea Serpent, created by Bob Clampett.
I see.
So come on, kids, let's flip our lids. Higher than the moon, 'cause how we Beanie and Cecil is
Your very own.
Bob Clampett cartoon.
That was the end of the Jetsons. I don't mean it was really the end of the Jetsons, but that was the end-titled music from the Jetsons show, performed by Hoyt Curtin, who was the music man behind the great Hanna-Barbera shows of the 1960s. And I thought I'd play the end title without the lyrics because it's so cool. We're going to hear more Hoyt Curtin in a moment, but let me just mention that we also just heard, prior to the Jetsons, we heard the Beanie and Cecil opening, a Bob Clampett cartoon, and I believe Bob probably wrote those, at least the lyrics. He got his name in there. I love that show. It's forgotten completely today by the younger generation, but if you're of a certain age, it's a classic. And if you get a chance to see them again, and they are out on DVD, they still hold up. And even if they don't hold up, the references are so funny and so cool, and of that Mad Men era. If you're just a fan of beatniks and early 60s and the Jet Age and what was going on at that time, the Beanie and Cecil show is a real time capsule of that sort of thing. Highly recommend that. Speaking of a time capsule of that era, Ross Bagdasarian was the performer of Witch Doctor, which we played, and that's from 1958. It was a #1 hit in 1958, and it was a novelty record where he billed himself on the record as Dave Seville, and those high-pitched voices were the Chipmunks. And, of course, this was the beginning of Alvin and the Chipmunks. He came out with this record. He was later asked, a few years later, to make an animated series out of the Chipmunks, and that became The Alvin Show, which was a primetime series, which was CBS's answer to The Flintstones. Flintstones was also a primetime series, and it was such a big hit that all the studios and all the TV channels in the early 60s had to have an animated series or 2 or 3, and CBS immediately competed with The Alvin Show. And of course we started the set with the Flintstones, voiced by the original cast. Hoyt Curtin is the music guy behind that, the Jetsons, and actually leads us well into the next set. We're going to start a little tribute to the adventure animation. What do I mean by that? Well, let's listen to this brilliant opening theme for Jonny Quest.
He's a demon on wheels. He's a demon and he's gonna be chasing after someone. He's gaining on you, so you better look alive. He's busy revving up the powerful Mach 5. And when the odds are against him and there's dangerous work to do, bet your life's eraser to see it through. Go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go! He's up and flying as he guns a car around the track. He's jamming down the pedal like he's never coming back. Adventure's waiting just ahead. Go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go Speed Racer, go!
A spider can spins a web in his eyes, catches thieves just like flies. Look out, here comes the Spider-Man. Yes, he's strong, this is Bud. He's got radioactive blood. Can't sleep from a thread to the hook overhead. Here there goes the Spider-Man. In the chills of the night, I'm the scene of a crime. Like a streak of light, rises in time. Spider-Man, Spider-Man, friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. When the man is ignored, action is his reward. Look out, here comes Spider-Man. Look out! I'm Spider-Man.
That was the Ramones singing the Spider-Man theme. And I love the Ramones and I love the Spider-Man theme. That Spider-Man theme, written by Robert Harris and Paul Francis Webster. I don't know where they are today, but they probably knocked that theme out really fast in 1967. And it was the theme for the Ralph Bakshi Spider-Man ABC Saturday morning cartoon show. But it has lived on forever. It's been used in the recent Spider-Man movies. Marvel, which of course is a powerhouse now, has been using that theme quite a lot. It was even in the recent Simpsons movie. So whoever has the royalties for that theme is doing very well. I hope those guys are doing well. It's a great song. We started our set with the Johnny Quest theme, written by Hoyt Curtin. And this track was taken from a brand new, just released Johnny Quest CD original television soundtrack, which features music by Hoyt Curtin and Ted Nichols. John Burlingame, music critic, wrote the notes, and Lucas Kendall, Taylor White, and Nick Raniere produced this new album for La La Land Records. It's a limited edition of 3,000. It's all the music from every episode of Johnny Quest. And if your first thought is nerd, well, it shouldn't be, because this is brilliant music. And you just heard the theme a moment ago. Now we're going to go back in time to the classic Hollywood era. And the music on the tracks in these old cartoons, the old 7-minute cartoons from MGM and Warner Brothers and in UPA. I mean, they used great musicians. The greatest musicians in Hollywood were the studio musicians back then. But of course, Carl Stalling and Scott Bradley peppered the music that they would compose for each cartoon with popular music of the time, old classics, PD, classical music, and just anything that struck their fancy as just right for a cartoon. One of those people, and usually on every one of my broadcasts, we cannot do one of these without a number from Raymond Scott. Raymond Scott's music is part of the soundtrack of cartoons, part of the soundtrack of our lives. Today we're going to do one of my favorite Raymond Scott tunes in a 18th century drawing room. And this was used in many, many Warner Brothers cartoons. The Aristocat, Bugs Bunny and the Three Bears, What's Cookin' Doc, I Got Plenty of Mutton, Inky and the Circus, The Scarlet Pumpernickel, Dog Collared, Gift Wrapped, Deduce You Say, People Are Bunny, Rabbit Romeo, not to mention on Ren and Stimpy and Man's Best Friend. You'll recognize the tune. In an 18th century drawing room. In an 18th century drawing room. Great track by Raymond Scott, used many times by Carl Stalling. And speaking of Carl Stalling, we're going to listen to one of those tracks where it's just the raw music from a cartoon. This is Stalling leading his orchestra, the highs, the lows, all over the place. Just listening to Stalling's cartoon tracks is a revelation because it's almost like abstract music. And it is abstract music, but it actually, in real life, it's to a purpose. It's underlining what's on the screen. But if you close your eyes and just listen to the music, without the sound effects, without the dialogue, it really takes you to another place. And we're going to do that right now. We're going to get High and the Flighty. That's the name of the cartoon, High and the Flighty. It was a Robert McKimson cartoon featuring Foghorn Leghorn and Daffy Duck, a rare team-up. At the very beginning of this raw studio track, you'll hear Carl himself telling the orchestra the name of the cartoon they're about to play for, and then you'll hear the orchestra laugh at the title. It's a pun of a famous movie from that time. So sit back and let's listen to some raw, pure Carl Stalling.
Production number 1392, The High and the Flighty. By
We just heard Carl Stalling, The High and the Flighty, a classic cartoon track. And it's just so wonderful to hear that music like that. It's, to me, I call that the soundtrack of my life. That is the soundtrack. That's the music I hear when I'm driving around. Carl Stalling's counterpart at the MGM studio was Scott Bradley. And he did all the music for the Tom and Jerry cartoons and the Tex Avery cartoons and the Spike and Tyke cartoons that were done there. And he was equally a genius at combining, classic music, popular music, music from MGM movies into a cohesive whole that would underline the action in any of these cartoons. Here's TV of Tomorrow, one of the great Tex Avery cartoons, and if you listen closely, you'll hear signature tunes like Sing Before Breakfast, Broadway Rhythm, Over the Rainbow, and many, many MGM favorites in an effort to get under this Tex Avery spot gag cartoon. Doesn't matter what it's about, sit back and enjoy Scott Bradley's TV of Tomorrow. That was Scott Bradley. That was a great MGM cartoon. This is Jerry Beck. You've been listening to Cartoons in Stereo, coming from the studios of KPFK in Los Angeles. For now, that's all, folks.